Hi, my name is Chris Ebling, and I'm a docent here at for the Rockwall County Historical Society. Welcome to Harry Myers Park. Before we go into the museum, I'd like to spend a little bit of time orienting you to the location and giving you a history of the region as well. So first, what I'd like you to do is dream a dream with me. So close your eyes and imagine you're standing on the shore of a vast ocean. An ocean that stretches from Canada to North Texas in the south, and Kansas to the east and the Rocky Mountains to the west. But instead of water, this ocean is an ocean of grass with waves as tall as 10 feet undulating across the plains. At your feet is little bluestem, which along with the other grasses, such as Indian grass, eastern gamma grass, side oats grama, dominates the landscape and make up the bulk of the plant life. Below the grasses, the prairie is alive with color as wildflowers bloom throughout the spring, summer, and fall. Circling high above you, you'll see hawks and vultures searching for a meal. Listen carefully and you hear the sounds of prairie chickens drumming on the hillocks to attract a mate, and the yelp of prairie dogs, sentries calling out their warnings. Tens of millions of bison wander across the land, driven by inner calendars that guide them throughout the year. Perhaps you catch a hint of smoke in the air as a fire rages across the prairie far away. Packs of wolves, groups of native hunters, and the occasional mountain lion follow the herds in their eternal quest for food. In front of you lies a reconstruction of the Blackland Prairie, so named for the rich, deep, black soils that lie underfoot. The Blackland Prairie ecosystem extends from North Texas to San Antonio, encompassing some 11,500,000 acres of land. Now, fire and bison played a critical role in maintaining the prairie ecosystem. Historians believe that on average, any given part of the prairie burned about every 7 years. Frequent fire prevented woody plant species from becoming established, while deep roots protected the grasses from permanent damage. Fire also released nutrients back into the soil, resulting in a fresh bloom of protein-rich grasses for the bison to eat. The bison feasted on the new growth while their uniquely shaped hooves churned the prairie, mixing the nutrients back into the soil beneath. The prairies have been home to humans for millennia, drawn by abundant wildlife and rich soils. Historians and archaeologists place the native Caddo people in the area as early as 4,000 years ago. The Caddo were a farming people and took advantage of the many natural meadows and fertile bottomlands lands to grow their crops. The first permanent European settlers picked up where the Caddo left off, first farming the patches of open meadow that the Caddo had maintained for centuries, then expanding their farms until virtually all of the native prairie was converted to human purpose. Today, less than 1/10% of the original Blackland Prairie remains, confined to small remnants like this scattered across Texas. The vast majority of the prairie was converted to farms, cities, and roads long ago. The 2 acres before you represent a small piece of reconstructed prairie for you to enjoy. The first European settlers arrived in the area in the early 1840s. Charles Finton Mercer, who is a Princeton graduate and a resident of Virginia, arrived in what was then called Peters Colony near Dallas in 1843. He requested and was granted permission to bring in 100 families to his new colony, which is called Mercer Colony, over a 3-year period. However, he was only able to attract about 108 people during that 3-year period. Did you know that this area was not always part of Rockwall County? First it was part of Nacogdoches County, then Henderson County, and finally a part of Kaufman County. But the residents of the northern part of the county complained that the county seat of Kaufman was too far away for them to travel to conduct business at the courthouse. Remember that people back then either traveled on foot or by horseback, and that a successful trip to the courthouse could literally take days. They petitioned the state for a new county, and the state of Texas chartered Rockwall County in 1873. Both the county and the city of Rockwall are named for a unique underground rockwall formation that crosses the area, and Rockwall County is the smallest county in Texas. The city of Rockwall was platted in 1854. Okay, this building is called the Manson La Moro Hartman House, after the people that lived here the longest. We believe that the house, built by W.C. Bowles in 1850, is the oldest structure in Rockwall County. The first 2 rooms were built in a dog trot style set on 4 Bodart posts. A dog trot meant that a house was made up of two separate rooms connected with a breezeway in between them with very high ceilings. Typically one room was for cooking and the other room was for living and sleeping. This was to keep the house cooler during the hot Texas summers and was popular in early Texas before fans and air conditioners became available. The other rooms that you see were added to the house over the years as the house was sold to larger and larger families. Now, the house was not originally at what is now Harry Myers Park, but used to be located in downtown Rockwall at 106 West Washington Street. In 1883, the house was sold, its contents auctioned, and the house given to the Rockwall County Historical Foundation, who moved it to this location. Now, some interesting people lived in this house over the years. Mr. Henry Walker Manson was born in Tennessee on February 12th of 1843 and served as a soldier in the Confederate States of America with the 7th Tennessee Regiment. After the war, he came to Texas, where he practiced as a physician and published the Rockwall Success, which was the first local newspaper. He went on to represent Rockwall and Dallas counties in the Texas State Legislature. Now, Jessie Estelle Castle-Lamoro was born in Michigan on July 30th, 1866, and moved to Texas in May of 1898. She graduated from the University of Michigan Dental College in 1896 and was the first woman with formal dentistry training to practice in the entire state of Texas. Inside the house, you'll be able to look at some of her dental equipment that she actually used while she was practicing dentistry here, and you'll be able to find out why going to the dentist was such an event back then. Now, the remainder of the grounds contain structures typical of a working farm in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So farmers raised their own meat and vegetables, so they didn't need to buy much other than sugar and coffee from the local stores. Every farm would have had a garden consisting of potatoes, onions, asparagus, beans, and things like dewberries. The corn crib would have held feed corn for the livestock. The windmill provided water for the livestock. The well on this property was a deep water well and produced water even during droughts. Neighbors came to collect water when their wells would run dry during dry spells. Now, the house didn't have internal plumbing, so the family would have to use an outside pump for their fresh water and an outhouse as a bathroom. When it was cold, or during the night, the family would have used chamber pots kept in their bedrooms rather than make the long walk out to the outhouse. And you'll be able to see an example of one of those when you tour the inside of the museum as well. Okay, a typical day on a farm would rise early by about 5 o'clock in the morning. Men would milk the cow and feed the livestock, while the women fixed a hearty breakfast of biscuits, eggs, bacon, and syrup. After breakfast, it was off to work in the fields. Most of the land in this area was farmed for cotton due to the good climate and the rich soils. Cotton farmers often hired workers to help them with the cotton crop. Workers were paid both to either chop the cotton or actually pick the cotton. Chopping meant hoeing between the rows to eliminate weeds and to thin out the cotton crops. A typical worker would be paid about $2 a day for chopping cotton. Pickers would hang a 6-foot-long bag over their shoulders and walk the rows, putting cotton balls individually into the bags themselves. A typical sack held between 100 and 120 pounds of cotton. It would take most of the day to pick. Pickers were paid about a penny a pound for their harvest. So property owners had many options for farming their land. If their family was large enough, they would perform all of the necessary tasks themselves. When they needed help, they would either hire choppers and pickers or allow others to work their land through tenant farming or sharecropping. Both are very similar systems. Neither tenant farmers nor sharecroppers own their own land, but tenant farmers own their own equipment for farming, while the sharecroppers didn't. The landowner would provide a place for the farmer and his family to live in typically a tenant farmer cabin, and the tenant farmer would supply the labor and materials to plant the crops. When the crops were harvested, a tenant farmer would pay a portion of his harvest to the landowner, usually between 1/4 and 1/3 of the crop. This was a mutually beneficial arrangement, and in Rockwall County, it was not uncommon for a tenant farmer to stay on the same piece of land for 25 to 35 years. Okay, now this is an example of a typical 2-room tenant farmer cabin where a whole family of tenant farmers would have lived. The cabin would have been provided, as we said, by the owner of the property itself, but the farmers would have provided all their own equipment and tools on their own. This particular cabin is from Rockwall County. It was built in around 1920. Now, Louise Royce Pickens was born in a tenant farm cabin, much like this one, on January 19, 1921. Listen to her own words as she tells us what life was like as a tenant farmer in North Texas. But the cabin only had 2 rooms. One was the kitchen and living area. The other room with the fireplace was where the family slept so they could keep warm at night. The furnishings were simple. Many farmers built their own furniture. It was nice, but not extraordinary. There was no electricity. Kerosene lamps were used for light. There was an ice box that required a big square chunk of ice to keep everything cool. Of course, radios were rare because there wasn't any electricity. And magazines and a couple of books may be the only reading material that in the farmer's home. And because of that, books were often read over and over and over again. A number of things were required for these tenant farmers. A team of horses was needed to pull the plows and pull the wagon. Wagons were used to haul grain and supplies or take the family to church. A stock pond provided water for the livestock, and a water well was the source of water for the family. Farmers worked together to help one another dig their stock tanks and wells, and a typical water well would be between 20 and 30 feet deep. It would be lined with bricks or boat arc logs to keep the walls from caving in. There was an old gentleman who was called a diviner that would help the farmers locate where to dig their well. He would walk across the land holding a stick shaped like a wishbone in his hands, and when the stick began to point downward, that's where you dug your well. The main crop was cotton, but a garden was necessary to grow vegetables for the family to eat. Corn, cabbage, potatoes, beans were grown in the garden, and many farmers planted peach, pear, and apple trees so the family would have fresh fruit as well. Much of this produce would be canned or preserved in jars to be used later during the year. Sometimes the tomatoes would explode in their jars and make a loud noise like a firecracker going off. Sometimes cabbage would be preserved by burying it in a hole in the ground, lined with corn husks, and with more corn husks placed on top of the cabbage and then covering it up with dirt. Of course, a cow was necessary for milk. Chickens provided eggs. Hogs were raised for meat. Cats were important to have to keep the rats from eating the stored corn or grain. Terrier dogs were also useful members of the family, and the dogs were able to sniff out where the rats had burrowed under the ground, dig up their hiding places, and then the cats would catch them. Most farmers had beehives to provide honey and to pollinate crops. Sometimes when a farmer had to empty a hive, he could attract a swarm of bees by banging 2 pie pans together while standing near an empty hive. And the bees were attracted to the noise and would come and move into an empty hive. So farming was hard work. The tenant farmer could not afford to hire help. All the children had their own chores to do. Older children would milk the cow, help plow long rows for the cotton, using a horse and help gather crops and pick the cotton. The men would have to use what was called a middle buster plow themselves at the end of the season to plow up under the cotton stubble or corn stalks because it was such a hard job that it couldn't be done manually. When working out in the fields, it could be a long way from the house. A white cloth or cup towel was tied to the porch to signal that lunch was ready. It was a simple life. No one had much money. But everyone was happy and no one complained. So as you can see, this is a very busy place on a typical Saturday morning here in modern North Texas. But the land, this rich, dark land, sustained people for thousands and thousands of years. For the Native Americans, the land provided everything they needed to live. And the relationship with the land was a deeply, deeply spiritual one. Farmers were deeply connected to the land as well, and the land provided most of the things that they needed to live, although they still had to acquire some things on their own. But the farmers also brought a Judeo-Christian perspective to the land, that placed people separate from and above the land and made it into something to conquer and subdue. The land was not valued in and of itself as it was for the Native Americans, as was the case with the Native peoples, but the value lied in what could be extracted from the land. Today, if you walk across this road over here, on top of the road and looking west, you'll see the beginnings of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, which is a mega city of millions of people living and working in thousands of homes and buildings. The prairie has been replaced with manicured lawns, which cannot survive the Texas climate. The farms have been paved over with concrete roads and buildings. Most of the people who live here derive really nothing of value from the land itself other than its ability to support their home. So the future of the land in this area is uncertain. In our eternal and uniquely American quest for progress, primal agricultural lands like this are paved over every year to support the needs of our growing communities. Once lost, these lands can never be reclaimed, at least not in time measured in human time frames. So as you continue to walk through the park, try to imagine the sea of grass and wildflowers and farms that would have surrounded you here, and remember what has been lost.